Hello, data people. I'm your host, Sean Buskila, and this is the Leading with Data podcast, where I interview the humans who are leading with data. This podcast has no sponsors, no product promotions, and no paid participants. Just straightforward thought leadership and real data talk. Today's episode is all about the tips for the aspiring Chief Data and Analytics Officer. So, hey everybody, and welcome to Leading with Data. This is going to be a new podcast that we're starting this week. I have a number of guests lined up, but today our topic is going to be tips for the aspiring Chief Data Officer or CDO. And I have an incredible guest to bring up and share with us some of his thoughts around this. Amit, welcome first of all to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
Absolutely. So for those who don't know Amit has a really super interesting background that started about 20 years ago in the BI and analytics space, and through a number of really interesting companies. I suggest you check him out on LinkedIn or other social media. Amit has arrived today and he leads data governance for Walmart merchandising. And Amit, you'll correct me here if I'm wrong, but one of the things that you described as a key part of your role is bridging the gap between, or maybe just creating a bridge between the data folks and the business folks within the organization.
Absolutely. I've always believed that as data and analytics folks, we wear two hats, and that's kind of why we are the bridge. So we need to be consultants when we partner with our business and technical stakeholders, understand their needs, then come back and wear our analytics hat and data hat to figure out what data we have, what data we need, get that together, and then again wear our consulting hat to deliver the value and assist our stakeholders for the same. So that interface is why I call it a bridge between business and the data.
Yeah. And, I think this is a topic that comes up so much. And personally, I believe that this is going to become more and more of the role of the CDO. But, we're obviously not here to hear about what I'm thinking. And I'm going to ask you some questions around that. So,
Sure.
One of the things that I want to start with here, Amit, is when you and I chatted before this podcast, you mentioned that today you've spent a lot of time observing the CDO role. You've seen a lot of people in different companies step into this role, and it's something that you're building yourself up into. I'm really interested to hear what initially got you interested or intrigued with this position, and then what still excites you about that role?
So let me kind of answer the first question in two different perspectives. One, a more personal one, but the other one will be more of the role itself and what it could mean. From the personal perspective, I consider myself a student of strategy. I've enjoyed looking at various situations, initiatives, projects from a strategic perspective, longer term. What impact could it have? What are the dependencies, constraints, and the like? And what stood out to me pretty early on in the career is one of those ladders is data and analytics, because you have a visibility of the organization, you have the fuel that powers those insights and analytics, which is the data itself. And the role that was enabling that strategy and contributing to the organizational strategy was the CDO. The other side of it was the fact that organizations today can't operate only on gut feel. So the more organizations become structured, the more organizations have to deal with complexity of decisions. One of the underlying things has to be data. So given that particular dependency, you are trying to best enable data to become insight. And just to define what an insight to me, an insight is when an organization or a stakeholder can make a decision or take an action with the data or information that we provide them. And that is an insight, right?
Yeah.
So just given, the uniqueness of the value add that it is, and also the fact that data until recently was a stepchild, people thought about it later. And
Yeah.
now suddenly folks are waking up that, hey, this is critical. We need this. We all want to be data driven organizations. I'd say are some of the unique challenges and what makes it such an evolving space to add value and make a difference.
I completely agree. I think I meet a lot of people, whether it's early or late stages in their career. And one of the things that is very obvious is that people who are leading with data today are still very, very excited
Mhm,
about what their role entails
mhm,
and what the future holds for it. There's some fears that come with that, and we're going to
mhm,
talk about those as well. But that's something that really is there. So you've mentioned the evolution of this role, and I think that's very, very evident. The role
mhm,
is evolving extremely fast. I remember from my background in the earlier days of BI and analytics, the first CDOs seem to be very much on the systems side, so
mhm,
building up the right systems. It wasn't as much on the process, and it was
mhm.
still a little bit disconnected from the business. But I'm really interested. So you've worked at some, like I said before, some really great companies, and you obviously still do. Walmart is one of the top companies in the world. Um, from your perspective, how have you seen the CDO role evolve, and what do you think it's going to look like in the next kind of, let's say, even 2 to 3 years?
Uh, that's a really good question, right? Because it's kind of a bit of forecasting as well as to what we think we want it to be. Uh, so honestly, I think the CDO role is relatively new as a formal role. I think IT did a lot of the heavy lifting, as you'd be aware, around data and analytics, right? It was, hey, you guys are dealing with the software, you guys are dealing with the hardware. Can you do this also for us? Uh, I think it's a triangulation of a couple of factors. One, the volume, diversity, and scale of data that we got from big data. Two, the processing power that is available to process all the data that we were able to collect. Three, the sudden realization that there are privacy, compliance, and security implications to having this much data, and the need for someone to help navigate all of this in an organization. So that specialization, I think, is what led to the CDO role. I think if we look the pre-GDPR days, for example, not many companies would have even insisted on a chief data officer role, but in some ways, GDPR and some regulations force their hand because they say that, hey, there has to be someone who signs their name or names saying, hey, we are the chief data officer as well.
Yeah.
So I think it's a triangulation of those factors, as well as the pressure or the pressure from compliances and regulations that has kind of brought it to the forefront. I will add, though, that organizations have also, I think, started thinking about data as an asset strategically. Not just, hey, what analytics can I get, but hey, what data do I really need? How do I store it? What do I do with it? Who should I give access to, etc., is a more strategic perspective. And that again falls under the purview of a CDO or a CDO like organization. So I think it's these factors that have come together to make the CDO and the whole governance and the whole data strategy conversation top of mind today.
And do you think that it's going to continue along the same path of privacy processes, governance? I think you mentioned there.
Mhm.
Um, do you see any extension to the CDO role over the next kind of couple of years?
So I'm using the word CDO loosely, right? Some people call it chief analytics officer, chief insights officer,
Absolutely.
whatever those roles are. Um, my guess is that one, there's a lot of backlog to catch up on the data side. Because like I mentioned, it was kind of the stepchild, right? So you had disparate systems, you had data quality rules that were not properly defined, documentation may be lacking in many situations. and the like. So there's one aspect of it which is just catching up and improving data maturity, if I can call that, of not only making sure that the data is more identified and usable and adding value, but also, defining then the processes and rules and governance that's needed to keep it going. So one, overcoming this catch up; two, coming up with the regular operating, the new routines and the new culture that's required are going to be critical. But the reason I say it's going to go beyond that is that there is going to be everybody is aspiring to do self-service, which is how close can you get the data to the business stakeholders themselves so that they can do as much as they want, etc. Because today, one of the challenges with the bridge that we have is, if I'm a BI analyst, I'm playing catch up on the business domain
Yeah.
knowledge, right? A marketing person knows that much better than I will ever. So even at least for initial prototypes or initial level of analytics, as much as they can do themselves, that will be awesome, right? So getting there is a combination of governance, data, technology, processes, and abstracting some of these things to make them easy to use, like what many technology companies are doing. And navigating that journey for an organization is going to take some time.
Yeah.
So roughly navigating those three phases is going to be, I think, definitely a journey for any organization.
Absolutely. So I want to actually build on something that
Yeah.
you mentioned there, because you gave the example of somebody who's helping do analytics for marketing, and how the people who are in the actual marketing function sometimes understand the data, what it means, a lot better. And I think that from that grew another role, which I think most companies today are calling the data steward. A lot of conversations about defining the data steward. One observation that I've made, and I've shared it with a few leaders that I've spoken with in the data space, is that it seems very much that there's a potential for the stewards of today to kind of become the CDOs of tomorrow, because they are already so well positioned in what you mentioned, that position, but that sits very much in a good understanding between the data and the business. Do you agree with that notion or potential?
Let me take a step back and and this is one of my recent thought pieces, is I call it the tripod for data, successful data strategy in an organization. I think we need three areas of focus. We need the data teams themselves, which get us the data, call them what you want, data engineers, whatever. They source the data, they clean the data, they store it and make it available. You then have the analytics folks who pick up that data and then translate it into insights. So this could be data scientists, it could be business analysts, it could be any one of those. And then finally, you have that governance piece, which is the processes, the access, the stewardship, the self-service, the architecture of the data. So when these three work together is when the organization will be successful. Now, I think what you're getting at is that the person who has visibility of the three puts them in a good position to actually drive the organization in the right direction. And definitely, while data stewards and governance folks have that visibility, I think even the analytics folks have that potential, because whatever modeling they do, whatever use cases they support, they have to be sensitive to regulations and compliance, and they're interfacing with the business folks quite a bit as well, right? So I would say it's possible from both teams, so to speak.
That's interesting, because from what I've heard today, and from a lot of the materials that you've written and that we read out there, there's definitely a growing demand from the business side, from business executives and business leaders, to show the clear value of data in an organization. Now we know that this is a whole challenge, and this could this conversation could take us in a spiral into a different discussion. But I want to stay just focused on that, in the sense that it sounds as if, from what you're saying, that the data steward could be positioned very well to prove that value, because they have a very good understanding of the outcomes
Mhm.
from analytics. And same thing for the analyst. Do you agree with that, with that perspective?
Yes, I do. And I think we have to be a little more refined when it comes to the conversation around value. Uh, I mean, we've all heard data is the new oil, right? I mean, just stretching that analogy a little, if you think about it, most data organizations are trying to provide, gasoline to an organization. Now, if you ask a data person, hey, what's the value that your gasoline is generating? They can only go so far. They might say, hey, you know, with a tank of our gasoline, you can drive 350 miles, right? Without having to refuel. But where the value conversation gets interesting is when you merge in the product people, the analytics people, the business people, etc. Because that 350 miles, it could be for a business that generates $10,000. That 350 miles could be a leisure trip with the
Yeah.
family that has its own value, right? So if we think about data as one of the company resources, I've always called it a corporate asset. The value conversation becomes very interesting because then it's layers, right? So what value does the data team add? What value does the business team, the product team add? What value does the business team add and leadership add? And that aggregate, I think, is the value that we're talking about. Uh,
It's interesting that you brought up the idea of data is oil. I made a post today about it, trying to kind of break the cliche around that sometimes. And I said, one of the things I mentioned there is that data is like oil, but not necessarily in the way that you think. And one of the points there is that used irresponsibly, it
yeah.
sometimes can create more harm
Yes.
than benefit. So
Yep.
I think that's also something that is very much tied to the role of the CDO, is
Yes.
being able to show how to use data correctly, reliably, where it adds confidence to decisions, and not the other way around. I want to just ask a couple of like very kind of quick fire
Mhm.
questions here
Mhm.
to get your thoughts. So, do you think that data stewardship is actually a role that people who are looking to be CDOs should go for or stay
Uh,
away from? Sorry.
no. So data's, it's like, how do you want to contribute off data, I think, would be the conversation, right? You could contribute by being a data engineer, you could contribute by being a data architect, you could contribute by being a AI and machine learning analyst, you could contribute as a data steward. So I think we have the privilege to actually see what our passions are and to marry that with the role in this data ecosystem that we want to be part of. Now,
Okay.
having said that, like we discussed, if you have that bigger view, if you can build that bigger view on where data fits in the organization, what are the processes, what are the technologies, what are the compliances, and things like that, it definitely gives you a very big head start towards the CDO role. So, absolutely, I think that's a really good way to go up the ladder that way. Yes.
Okay. Next kind of quick question here.
Mhm.
So, 4 to 5 technologies or solutions that you think are a must-have for somebody who wants to be a CDO to be familiar with?
One of the recent ones is the whole around data governance, right? Catalogs, lineage, observability, data quality. That is a given, right? That's the fundamental documentation of what you have, what it means, and where is it coming from, right? So that's one set I would strongly recommend people being aware of. The second set is the visualization and analytics and BI tools are out there because those are the ones that help translate the data into end results and help those insights to be generated. The last one, I don't think there are that many technologies, but conceptually,
Yeah.
staying abreast of data security, staying abreast of compliance, privacy, and those developments is critical as well.
Oh, perfect. So yeah, that actually leads me to something very interesting. So you've mentioned here a lot about the position that data leadership, let's call it. Okay.
Mhm,
It could be a CDO, it could be somebody
mhm,
who's close to being a CDO, very much sits between the business side and the
mhm,
data side. If you had to design your
mhm,
ideal CDO,
mhm,
what is their percentage? How would you share the percentage between deep data understanding and deep
mhm.
business understanding? How much percent would you allocate to each one of those arms?
So I think business understanding has to be there, because if you're in an organization, the way the solutions or the approaches or strategy chosen is highly dependent on the business uh, understanding. Like, for example, certain sectors like healthcare and finance are heavily regulated. So, an awareness of those rules and those things will influence your strategy, right? So, that's the other reason why I was talking about the domain being critical as well. So, that I think is a must have at that level, right? You must have the ability to comprehend, use that terminology, align, and understand and deploy or mix that into whatever strategy is being formulated. Now, the data side of it, I think as you go higher, you can be a little more conceptual, in that you may not need to know every single column, every single table, and every single technical way of doing it, because that's something you can hire for. But at least the conceptual impact of how is a data mart different from a data lake, or what do I mean by the logical layer, or how do I model the data versus architect the data, would be really critical, because you're also building the organization that will help you do this. So you should know whether should I hire a data modeler, should I hire a data business analyst, or a AI and machine learning expert. It'll help with that as well. So that would be my take.
So if I heard you correctly, it sounds very close to 50-50 in terms
Yes.
of,
Yes.
yeah. So okay, very, very interesting. Going back to looking kind of ahead a little bit,
Mhm,
um, your thoughts over the next 5 years, are they
mhm.
going to be the same, more or less uh CDOs who are or people in the CDO position? Let's ask it that way.
I think we're going to have more, because the trend has been like we discussed. One, companies are realizing that they need the strategic focus. Two, if you look at it, there is an increasing amount of automation coming into tools themselves. And everybody's trying to build a complete stack, right? From data all the way to insight. And that means that the conversation is becoming less and less about how do I connect these tools together, and more about, hey, how do we make it such that we get value out of these tools? And you alluded to this as well, which is like, hey, how do you get, what's the value that's coming out of the data? So the more the value becomes front and center from a cost center to, hey, generate some value for the organization, I do suspect in the in the midterm at least, the number of CDOs and stuff is going to only grow. And I also suspect that it won't matter how big the organization is. I mean, today CDOs are almost the preview of the larger organizations. But I
Yes.
think the capabilities of a CDO will be required even for a startup, even for a mid-sized organization. It's a must.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's almost seems to be a correlation between the amount of investment that goes into data in an organization and the speed in which an organization brings on and defines the role of the CDO
Mhm,
and how
mhm.
that role actually grows, i.e., the
Yep.
team underneath that role. I'm sure that at Walmart, if we look at it, there's probably a direct correlation there because the more data you have and the more investment, the
Mhm,
more people are asking for ROI. And to the
mhm,
points that you've constantly made here, it's the CDO's role who is best positioned to deliver the value or at least the return on some of that investment. I think previously companies have looked to CIOs and CTOs to do this, but it seems like it's been a little out of their domain because looking at what we spoke about before, that 50-50, CIOs tend to be a bit more on the kind of 80-20 in favor of
mhm,
the technology side. So I think that's really interesting. Um, Maybe in a little bit of contrast to the
mhm,
previous question, um, this might be a little taboo, maybe after the news of Twitter, maybe a little bit less right now, but judging by the average tenure today of
Mhm,
CDOs in the market,
mhm,
um, it does it does seem to be a very, very challenging role. I think this is something that is spoken about within the circles of the
mhm,
CDOs quite a bit. There's a lot
mhm,
of reasons for that.
mhm,
Um, I want to ask you instead, maybe kind of from your experience, what have you really seen the pitfalls for the CDOs tend to fall into? Um, and if you can, what advice would you give for people avoiding them? And we're basing this on what you've observed out there so
mhm.
far.
Yeah, I wouldn't presume to give advice to someone senior to me, but just stuff that I'd like to be aware of or keep an eye on. Uh, One, if you actually look at the data journey, uh, right from source to the insight and the generation of new data, right, the loop. A lot of our time is spent downstream when we should be spending a good amount of time even before the data is generated, right? So how can we as data folks collaborate with product teams, engineering teams to collect and define the data upfront? I was just in a session today where they were talking about shift left, shift as much of the things, so prevent rather than detect, right? Prevent things
Yeah.
from happening. So I think that is hard in an already established organization. And that shift left does not always lead to immediate value, right? The value is more visible from, hey, I got this data, I turned it into this insight, or I found this trend kind of a conversation.
Yeah.
So there's that cultural shift that has to happen. There's also the amount of money it takes to make that happen, which is not cheap. It's not like I give you a data catalog and the job is done, right? The catalog's only the tool. Then we need stewards. Then we need data modelers. Then we need to maybe potentially reallocate what we are doing, etc. Right? So that shift again from being a stepchild to hey, uh, focus on this as well, I think is another challenge that we have to constantly keep our eyes on. The third one, I think, is just the whole compliance and privacy space is so transient right now. I remember a couple of months ago listening to how Singapore and the US, etc., are proposing like a Geneva contract for data. Because today, according to the current rules, it's very hard to move data from the US to Europe to other countries. Like, for example, China and India, for example, say data about our citizens shouldn't leave our geographical boundary.
Mhm.
Okay. But then if you want to run an AI and machine learning model on a global platform, you can't run it because this data is in India.
Yeah.
So, I think there's a lot of change that's happening on the privacy compliance perspective as well, even on the AI and machine learning side in terms of what algorithms are acceptable and all that. And I think these are three of the big ones that are causing the role and the expectations of the organization to change on a constant basis. So I think that just makes the role harder.
Yeah, I'll share with you why, but I'm a little surprised at that. We constantly hear that CDOs are actually asked to shift right, i.e., show more of the outcomes of the work that they're doing rather than shift left. Uh,
Sure. So I think if we look at the value conversation, the ultimate goal, and Douglas Laney in his book Infonomics says that ideally you want to have the able to put your data as an asset on a financial statement. I mean, we're not there yet, but if we can do that, then what will automatically happen is the trickle down effect will be that even generation of data will have a monetary value, right? So you'll think about, hey, is it worth generating another 2 terabytes of data if it's worth 1 cent a byte?
yeah.
Right? Or it's going to cost me 1 cent a byte. So that valuation is still, I think, where we are challenged as data leadership, because every other thing is looked by some metric or some valuation.
Yep.
right? Like marketing can say it is LTV minus cost of acquisition. Sales can say it is number of deals by deal value, right? So that I think is the challenge that we have uh, for this situation is how do you compute that value? And even actually, honestly, I'd go out on a limb and say, is it even fair to compute value at this stage?
It's a very interesting question, and a write up that I recently put together, and
Mhm.
I'm happy to share just a
Please.
thought from that. Is I think that what you're asking about here is how do you measure the value of data, which I think is very close to how do you measure a culture of data? But through a strategy session that I held at Chief Data Officer conference in Boston a few weeks
Mhm.
ago, there was a strategic discussion group that I led with another practitioner. And one of the thoughts that came out of that was, what if you could measure how many decisions across the
Mhm.
board in a company were made with data as
Mhm.
a parameter in this, and how many weren't? And I think it's not
Mhm.
an easy one, and I'll probably share
Mhm.
in the
Mhm.
comments here a
Mhm.
link to that article as well as some of the articles that you mentioned here.
Mhm.
But how do you feel about the ability to almost run a survey? You run a
Mhm.
survey, ask people how many of the last 20 decisions that you
Mhm.
made, did you have the data that you
Mhm.
wanted available to you
Mhm.
to support the decision?
I agree, and I like that idea. It's just that we have to balance quantity versus quality, right?
Yeah,
Because you could have one data point and it could mean tens of millions of dollars. It could be 20 insights and it just means $1
yeah,
or $10 for the thing, right? So I think it's a balance of the two, but I like the idea of getting a sense for, hey, how much of your thing was actually data backed.
yeah,
I think that's a good approach to it to start. The other side of this is the value of data changes based on the audience.
yeah,
This is what I was alluding to like before. Like if it's a tank of gas in your car, if you use it for commercial purposes, it has a different value versus the same tank of gas for a private individual enjoying themselves, right? So that I think throws an interesting mix into the thing where the conversation cannot be only what to the data teams, but to the business as a whole, saying that, hey, here's another corporate asset that is going to cost us so much money. What value have you gotten out of it downstream? And then work that back. And then also, I think it's a combination of bottom up and top down to see where the intersection point is.
absolutely. You know what, my data visualization and BI background is kind of going into crazy mode. And I'm thinking, if you had a heat map to show,
Uh-huh.
the different levels in the company,
Yep.
starting from level one, going all the way up to the executive
Mhm.
boardroom. If
Mhm.
you ran that survey, you could
Mhm.
probably create a correlation for the value of the decisions made across
Mhm.
that, the
Mhm.
number of decisions, and then
Mhm.
how many of them were actually kind of data backed, and put that as one of the measurements around the data function.
Yeah, but the other one is that's why the context is and the audience is important. Like, for example, some firms sell their data,
Yeah,
right? Walmart, for example, provides data to suppliers saying that, hey, this is how your products are going. Now, that value is different because that value depends on the supplier and the size of the supplier and their products and their relationship with Walmart and the like.
yeah,
Right, so it's a very interesting conversation that has different perspectives to it. So I kind of tend to come back to, hey, it's a corporate asset.
yeah. Absolutely. And I think based on what is happening, we hear this all the time, especially with the likes of Facebook, of
Mhm.
LinkedIn, of all of these companies. We all know that in the background, they say they're technology companies. They're very
Mhm.
much data companies. They
Yep.
sell the data. A lot of the time it's to advertisers and so on. Um, those companies put data as a front and center asset, whereas you still get that notion from companies who don't use data as a revenue generating tool
Mhm.
yet, as in for commercial use. Um, they're still seeing it as a liability. They're still questioning the value of it. And, based on what you've shared today, it seems like the CDO is so well positioned to start bridging that. And
Yes.
I want to tie it to what your role today, right? Your
Mhm.
role today, you defined it to me earlier on in the conversation, and then previously, that really kind of you're there to create that bridge. It's a huge task, right? We
Yep.
know that it's never ending, and it's something that a lot of data leaders are striving for, right? If you speak
Mhm.
to a lot of them, they say we just need to explain to the business the value,
Mhm.
and we need to explain to the data engineers what it is that the business is asking for, and kind of almost create that translation layer between them. I'm interested to hear, when you started your role today,
Mhm.
the role that you're
Mhm.
in today, was the team already kind of well on its way to create that bridge? That's my first question. And maybe the second one is, what are some of the first things that you did in this current role? Is there any impact that you've observed seeing,
Mhm.
what bridging actually does, and how
Mhm.
how it's come to fruition?
So the team I'm part of is new. It was started less than 6 months ago,
Okay.
6 or 7 months ago, with my manager, uh, initiating the whole journey. So, in our case, there was already leadership buy-in, and leadership had realized that, hey, we have to treat data strategically. We can't keep building new data sets and new reports and create, like a ocean of stuff, right? We have to be more diligent and more deliberate about this.
Yeah.
And I enjoy building teams and growing teams, which is why this was also exciting for me, because you get to be on the journey from the ground floor up. Uh, what I will say is that when such a, like any change, you will have the people who embrace it and the people who dislike it.
Yep.
The people who embrace it generally see a little more of the bigger picture and realize that, hey, I don't want to keep doing the same thing again and again, or I don't want to be paying for the same routine again and again, right? I think where the change management is required from us, because I think that one of the biggest things data does is it causes cultural change, is we have to influence and nudge and partner and collaborate with our stakeholders whose way of doing things or routines are changing completely, right? Maybe they were happy doing something with Excel, and but now you're like, hey, here's an easier tool potentially, but there's a learning curve. So I think it's a combination of the two, where we have to balance that cultural change that has to happen either from the decision or to enable that decision and insight that we have to navigate and take forward.
Oh, that's great. First of all, this has been incredible. I'm so grateful for the conversation and the insight here. I do have one last question for
Yeah,
you,
yeah.
and in a certain way, you've touched on this quite a bit here. But you know what? I wrote down the question, so we're going to ask it anyway.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I read the recent article that you wrote, that you mentioned earlier on, kind of the idea of a tripod. And
Yeah.
if I, and what the article, from the way I understood it, meant is that when you're looking to structure a successful, productive, effective data team, really it stands on three fundamental legs, which are data, governance, and then analytics. Um, First of all, tell me if I didn't understand it correctly, but if I did understand it correctly, um, what are your thoughts uh, in particular around whether all three of those need to fall under the CDO? And I know it's difficult to measure proficiency, but what level of proficiency would you um, recommend for an aspiring CDO to take in each one of these, and maybe even prioritize them, if that makes sense?
So it again depends on the organization's maturity, right? In some cases, you can focus only on the technology and make progress. In some cases, you have to focus on the governance piece of it. You don't have a choice, right? So depending on the same. Now, for a CDO, I think you need to be aware of all three, at least at a conceptual level. You may not know the inner technical workings of it, but you should know the language, you should know the jargon, you should know the impact of all three of them. You don't even have to have done it before,
Yeah.
right? So that I think is table stakes for a CDO. Then, of course, is the domain piece, like we discussed. The goal of that piece was to say that, hey, don't think about data just as, I pipe it, I do analysis, and I'm done. But also think about the third piece, which is the strategy. And the reason I like the tripod approach is you can do with two legs, but then you have to move very quickly, right? I can just
Yeah.
do data and analytics, but then I have to constantly work on data and analytics because there's no long-term view on it, right?
Yeah.
Uh, but the advantage of a third one is then you have the stability. And if you adjust one, like for example, if you have to invest more on data, you can adjust the analytics and governance piece of it to compensate. Whereas if you have only two legs, if you're running only on data and analytics and one of them gets affected, the other one is stuck. So, yeah.
Amazing. And of course, I'm going to share the links to the article down below
Please.
so people can take a
Yep.
look at it. I'll share your profile as well here. I mean, last question here. If one of your children one day came over to you and said,
Mhm.
"No, we want to be chief data, chief analytics
Mhm.
officers in a company,"
Mhm.
would you be kind of the give them the thumbs up, or would this be a sit down conversation?
I think it would be a sit down conversation because so many things are changing so quickly, automation, self serve. Who knows the interfaces of tomorrow, right? People may be doing things in virtual reality and stuff like that, right? That's going to open so many other new interfaces. So I think it'll be an interesting sit down conversation, but it's definitely something I would recommend for them to consider as if they're passionate about it. Absolutely.
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah.
Amit, I just want to say once again, thank you so much for all the insight, all the information
Thank you
here.
for the opportunity.
Absolutely. It's been wonderful to have you. And
Yep.
yeah, we'll connect again very soon, I'm sure.
Sure.
All
Awesome.
right.